On December 31, 1941, Admiral Chester Nimitz formally took command of the United States Pacific Fleet aboard the submarine USS Grayling, a choice of venue forced upon him by the simple fact that Pearl Harbor no longer had an intact surface warship suitable for hosting a formal change of command ceremony. Nimitz arrived to a harbor still filled with the wreckage of America's battleship fleet, a demoralized command staff still processing the scale of the disaster, and a strategic situation that most observers at the time considered close to catastrophic. What Nimitz actually did in the days and weeks following his arrival, the specific decisions he made about staff, strategy, and morale, would shape the entire trajectory of the Pacific War that followed. This is the story of what Nimitz did the moment he learned the full scope of what had happened at Pearl Harbor, and how a calm, deliberate assessment of the disaster's actual scope, rather than its apparent scope, set the foundation for everything the Pacific Fleet would accomplish over the following 4 years. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How does a new commander walk into the aftermath of the worst naval disaster in his country's history, and within days, begin steering that same shattered command toward the war's eventual turning point? Prior to the war, Nimitz had also served in a series of increasingly senior administrative and training roles within the Navy, including a period overseeing the Bureau of Navigation responsible for officer personnel assignments across the entire service. Experience that gave him an unusually thorough, first-hand understanding of the Navy's broader officer corps and its individual members' specific strengths and capabilities, institutional knowledge that would prove directly relevant when he began the process of evaluating which of Kimmel's existing staff officers to retain and in what specific capacities during his own transition into command. Nimitz's own background before this appointment had centered heavily on submarine warfare, and notably, on logistics and fleet maintenance responsibilities. A career trajectory that, while not built around the kind of direct combat command experience some observers might have expected for such a consequential wartime appointment, had given him deep and genuinely relevant expertise in exactly the kind of fleet-wide organizational and resource management challenges the shattered Pacific Fleet would immediately require of its new commander. It is worth situating Nimitz's specific arrival within the broader sequence of command decisions and personnel appointments this channel has already examined across earlier episodes covering the Pacific War's various turning points. Since Nimitz's own subsequent judgment in selecting and trusting officers like Spruance, Halsey, and the code-breaking teams whose work this channel has documented in dedicated episodes all trace back, in a meaningful sense, to the specific evidence-based, calmly analytical command temperament he first demonstrated during these earliest days at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz's appointment as Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, came directly as a consequence of the Pearl Harbor disaster itself, replacing Admiral Husband Kimmel, who was relieved of command in the attack's immediate aftermath, amid the broader effort to assign responsibility for the catastrophic failure to anticipate and defend against the Japanese strike. Nimitz received this appointment while serving in Washington, and his journey to Pearl Harbor to formally assume command took place against the backdrop of a fleet, a command staff, and a broader American public still absorbing the shock of an attack that had, within a matter of hours, destroyed or damaged the core of American battleship power in the Pacific. Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day of 1941, and the scene that greeted him upon his arrival reflected the full physical scope of the disaster in a way that written reports and photographs, however detailed, could not fully convey. Sunken and damaged battleships remained visible throughout the harbor. Oil continued leaking from ruptured fuel tanks, and salvage and recovery operations continued around the clock, even as Nimitz began the process of formally assessing the command he was about to assume. The choice of a submarine for the formal change of command ceremony, while born of simple practical necessity given the surface fleet's devastated condition, carried its own unintended symbolic weight that several officers present at the time reportedly noted, a new commander assuming responsibility for a shattered surface fleet from the deck of the one category of naval vessel that had remained almost entirely unaffected by the attack. A coincidence of circumstance that nonetheless foreshadowed how heavily American naval strategy would come to rely on exactly the kind of underwater and, eventually, carrier-based capability that conventional pre-war battleship doctrine had significantly undervalued. Stop and consider the specific psychological environment Nimitz walked into, because the physical destruction, however severe, was not the only challenge he faced in these opening days. The Pacific Fleet's surviving command staff, many of whom had served directly under Kimmel and had personally experienced the shock and trauma of watching the attack unfold, remained in a state of genuine demoralization and uncertainty about their own professional futures, uncertain whether Nimitz's arrival would bring a wholesale replacement of Kimmel's staff or some more measured transition that would allow experienced officers to continue serving in their existing roles. This decision was not without genuine political risk for Nimitz personally, since the broader American public and press coverage in the weeks following Pearl Harbor demanded accountability for the disaster, in terms that might have made a wholesale staff replacement the more politically expedient and immediately reassuring course of action. A pressure Nimitz appears to have consciously resisted in favor of the less dramatic, but ultimately more operationally sound approach of retaining proven expertise wherever his own assessment concluded that expertise had performed adequately, given the circumstances actually faced. Nimitz made the deliberate and, in retrospect, clearly sound decision to retain the substantial majority of Kimmel's existing staff, rather than conducting the kind of wholesale housecleaning that a less measured commander, arriving amid such a catastrophic disaster, might have been tempted toward. This decision reflected Nimitz's own calm assessment that the officers who had served under Kimmel were, for the most part, skilled professionals who had performed reasonably given and genuinely unprecedented and largely unanticipated form of attack, rather than incompetence, whose individual failures had caused the disaster and who therefore deserved wholesale removal from their positions. Kimmel's own fate following his relief from command remained a subject of considerable post-war controversy and historical debate, with subsequent investigations and congressional inquiries examining for years afterward exactly how much individual responsibility for the disaster properly belonged to Kimmel personally versus broader, systemic intelligence and communication failures at levels well above his own direct command authority, a debate that continued long after Nimitz himself had moved well past the immediate crisis and into the broader work of prosecuting the Pacific War, but one that inevitably shaped the institutional context within which Nimitz's own staff retention decisions were made and understood. Nimitz's specific handling of the harbor tour he conducted in his first days at Pearl Harbor illustrates the broader command philosophy that would characterize his entire wartime leadership. Rather than dwelling exclusively on the visible devastation surrounding him, accounts from officers present during this period describe Nimitz methodically working through exactly what had actually been lost against what had, despite the attack's severity, actually survived intact. A careful, deliberate accounting that produced a considerably less catastrophic overall assessment than the harbor's visible wreckage alone might have suggested to a less analytically disciplined observer. This detailed accounting required Nimitz to work closely with his engineering and logistics staff during his very first days in command, reviewing damage assessment reports and physical inspection findings across the entire harbor facility to construct as complete and accurate a picture as possible of exactly what remained operational. A methodical approach to information gathering under crisis conditions that several officers who worked directly with him during this period specifically credited as establishing, from his very first days, the calm, evidence-based command style that would characterize his leadership throughout the remainder of the war. Specifically, Nimitz noted that the Japanese attack, devastating as it had been against the battleship fleet moored along what came to be called Battleship Row, had left several categories of critical infrastructure and capability entirely untouched. The massive fuel oil storage tank farms, whose destruction would have forced the entire Pacific Fleet to withdraw to the American West Coast for lack of fuel, the submarine base and its docked vessels, the shipyard's dry docks and repair facilities essential to any recovery effort, and, perhaps most significantly given how the war's subsequent course would actually unfold, every single American aircraft carrier assigned to the Pacific Fleet, all of which had been at sea rather than in harbor on the morning of the attack and had therefore escaped the Japanese strike entirely. The crew survival statistics from the attack, while overshadowed in most historical accounts by the material destruction of the ships themselves, also factored into Nimitz's broader reassessment, since the majority of sailors serving aboard the damaged and sunken battleships had, despite the ship's losses, survived the attack itself, meaning the fleet retained a substantial pool of trained, experienced naval personnel who could be redistributed to surviving vessels, and eventually, to the new construction that would begin arriving from American shipyards in the months and years ahead. A human capital resource that mattered just as much to the fleet's long-term recovery as the physical infrastructure Nimitz's initial assessment had also carefully catalogued. This specific, deliberately reframed assessment served a purpose considerably more significant than simple accounting, providing Nimitz with the concrete factual foundation needed to begin rebuilding morale among a command staff and broader fleet population still reeling from the attack's psychological impact. Rather than offering vague reassurance disconnected from the visible destruction surrounding everyone at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz could point to specific, verifiable facts: the intact fuel supplies, the undamaged repair infrastructure, and above all the surviving carriers, that gave his subordinates genuine reason to believe the fleet retained real fighting capability despite the battleship losses that dominated the harbor's visible landscape. Some historians studying the attack's planning in the decades since have suggested that Japanese commanders, including Admiral Yamamoto himself, whose own complicated relationship with the war this channel has examined extensively in earlier episodes, may have deliberately prioritized destroying capital ships specifically because Japanese naval doctrine, itself still heavily oriented around traditional battleship-centered thinking, despite Yamamoto's own more sophisticated personal understanding of carrier aviation's growing importance, simply did not fully appreciate, at an institutional level, just how strategically decisive the fuel infrastructure and repair facilities actually were, relative to the more visible and symbolically satisfying destruction of America's battle line. The undamaged fuel oil tank farm specifically represented perhaps the single most consequential piece of infrastructure to survive the attack relatively intact, since their destruction, had Japanese planners targeted them specifically, rather than concentrating their strike on the more visible and symbolically significant battleships, would have forced an American strategic withdrawal from Hawaii entirely, a consequence that several historians studying the attack's planning and execution have identified as one of the more significant tactical oversights in Japan's otherwise carefully planned strike. Whether that oversight reflected a deliberate choice to prioritize destroying capital ships or simply an underappreciation of the tank farm's strategic significance relative to the battleships moored nearby. Nimitz communicated this reframed assessment not merely through private staff briefings, but through visible, direct engagement with personnel across the harbor during his early inspection tours, a personal, hands-on approach to morale, rebuilding that several accounts from sailors and junior officers present during this period specifically recalled as genuinely reassuring, a senior admiral willing to walk through the wreckage personally and speak directly to the men whose ships had been destroyed, rather than issuing reassurance exclusively through more distant, formal command channels. Nimitz's broader strategic approach in the weeks immediately following his arrival reflected the same calm, methodical temperament that had characterized his initial assessment of the harbor's condition, prioritizing salvage operations for the damaged and sunken battleships, several of which would eventually be raised, repaired, and returned to active service later in the war, while simultaneously beginning to plan how the fleet's surviving carrier force, the specific asset his initial assessment had identified as the war's actual decisive weapon, even though pre-war doctrine had not yet fully recognized this shift, could be employed against Japanese-held positions even in these earliest and most resource-constrained months of the war. Vice Admiral William Halsey, whose own subsequent wartime command decisions this channel has examined in dedicated episodes covering both his arrival at Guadalcanal and the Taffy III crisis at Leyte Gulf, commanded the carrier task force that executed several of these earliest raids, an early operational relationship between Nimitz and Halsey that predated and directly informed the trust Nimitz would later place in Halsey during the far more consequential command decisions still to come later in the war. This planning produced the early hit-and-run carrier raids against Japanese-held positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands in February of 1942. Naval planners understood these operations carried genuine tactical risk given the still limited number of American carriers available and the general uncertainty about Japanese naval strength and intentions in the weeks following Pearl Harbor. A risk Nimitz judged worth accepting specifically because the morale and experience benefits of demonstrating continued offensive capability outweighed the relatively modest material stakes any individual raid actually involved. Operations that, while inflicting relatively limited material damage on Japanese forces, served the equally important purpose of providing American carrier crews with genuine combat experience and, critically, demonstrating to a still-recovering fleet and a shaken American public that the Pacific Fleet retained the capability and the will to take offensive action against Japan, even in the immediate aftermath of the most devastating attack in American naval history. The specific American public reaction to these early carrier raids, communicated through wartime press coverage eager for any sign of American resilience following the shock of Pearl Harbor, provided exactly the kind of morale benefit Nimitz's strategic calculation had anticipated. Even though military historians studying the raid's actual tactical results have generally assessed their direct material impact on Japanese forces as relatively modest, a distinction between propaganda and morale value versus narrow tactical effectiveness that Nimitz appears to have understood clearly and factored deliberately into his early strategic planning. Nimitz's early decisions regarding staff continuity, strategic reassessment, and calculated offensive action established a command foundation that would prove directly relevant to the Pacific Fleet's subsequent conduct throughout the entire war. A pattern of calm, methodical, evidence-based decision-making that this channels separate episodes covering his later command decisions, including his selection of Raymond Spruance to command carrier forces at Midway and his broader relationship with the code-breaking teams whose work made that battle's decisive American victory possible, have already examined in detail. The specific temperament Nimitz demonstrated in his first days at Pearl Harbor, the willingness to look past visible catastrophe toward a more complete and accurate accounting of actual remaining capability, recurred throughout his subsequent wartime command decisions. A consistency that several historians studying his overall wartime leadership have identified as one of his most significant and enduring command qualities. His relationship with the code-breaking community stationed at Pearl Harbor, examined in greater detail in this channel's separate episode on the Yamamoto intercept and the broader intelligence effort behind Midway, also began taking shape during these earliest weeks of his command. As Nimitz worked to understand and properly value the intelligence capability his predecessor's staff had already been developing, a working relationship built on the same evidence-based, methodical trust in demonstrated expertise that had already shaped his decision to retain Kimmel's broader staff rather than replace it wholesale. Nimitz went on to command the Pacific Fleet for the entire remainder of the war, presiding over the transformation of a shattered, demoralized command into the force that would eventually project American naval power across the entire Pacific and ultimately to the doorstep of the Japanese home islands themselves. He later served as Chief of Naval Operations following the war, a capstone to a career whose most consequential foundational decisions, this episode has argued, were made not in any single dramatic battle, but in the calm, deliberate assessment he conducted during his very first days at Pearl Harbor, walking through the wreckage of America's Pacific battleship fleet, and beginning, almost immediately, the methodical work of building the force that would eventually win the war. Remember the question this story opened with: how does a new commander walk into the aftermath of the worst naval disaster in his country's history, and within days, begin steering that same shattered command toward the war's eventual turning point? The honest answer, drawn from the specific documented sequence of Nimitz's own conduct across those first critical days, is that it came down to a disciplined refusal to let visible catastrophe substitute for an accurate, complete accounting of what actually remained. A decision to preserve proven expertise rather than indulge the politically tempting but operationally costly urge toward wholesale replacement, and a willingness to communicate that clear-eyed reassessment directly and personally to a shaken command staff who needed genuine, specific reasons to believe the fleet could still fight, not vague reassurance disconnected from the wreckage surrounding them. If you want to understand how a new commander walks into the aftermath of the worst naval disaster in American history and, within days, begins steering that same shattered command toward the war's eventual turning point, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.